I wasn't going to do this story, but I do like this story. Um, and there's two aspects of the story that I want to discuss, and so that's the way I wrote it in these two line terms. One of my subscribers, was it Mysterious Jeff Kuntz, sent me this clip showing that China had landed on the dark side of the moon. I long for the day where I look at this achievement and it's not a Chinese achievement, but it's a human achievement. I mean, they've touched the rover down on the dark side of the moon and they're taking pictures and so forth. But that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, and they had to overcome several technological challenges in order to make that work. And they did make it work. And it's apparently sending back pictures and everything else now. I'll even show parts of it. Yeah, I long for the day where something like this is not said as a Chinese government did X, or the Chinese did X or Y. That it would be a human being was able to go to the dark side of the moon, or at the very least, a rover was sent to the dark side of the moon. But they have plenty of other expeditions that they're planning on top of this. So let's talk about that part first. So let's show, and my argument here is going to be there's an implicit and there's an explicit reality here. This is the explicit reality. I want to talk about the implicit afterwards. A Chinese lunar rover has landed on the far side of the moon in a global first that boosts its ambitions to become a space superpower. The Chang'e 4's probe touched down and sent a photo of a so-called dark side of the moon to Quejiero satellite, which was relay communications to be controlled on Earth, state broadcaster CCTV said. China is pouring billions into a military-run space program with hopes of having a crewed space station by 2022 and eventually sending humans to the moon. The Chang'e 4's lunar probe mission, named after the moon goddess in Chinese mythology, launched in December from the southwest of Xichang Launch Center. Let's see. I want to play the video of this. Yeah.
The Chang'e 4 probe, comprising a lander and a rover, touched down at 10:26 a.m. Beijing time. It was China's first ever attempt to land on the far side of the moon. China's Space Administration released images of a rocky surface around the landing site on the moon's South Pole Aitken crater, the oldest, widest and deepest crater on the moon's surface. Because the moon takes as long to rotate on its own axis as it does to complete an orbit of the Earth, its far side is rarely glimpsed from Earth. The Chang'e 4 was launched in China on December 7th and arrived in lunar orbit on the 12th. The probe will examine rocks to learn more about its history and carry out biological experiments. Beijing has invested billions of dollars into its military-run space program. This latest technical feat demonstrates China's growing space ambitions. Officials plan to launch a manned space station by 2022, another manned mission to the moon, and send a rover to land on Mars.
They're planning big things. And China has its issues, don't get me wrong, it's a totalitarian state to some degree. But it makes me wistful of the JFK time of him, saying we're gonna go to the moon. We do this because this, poses the best of our abilities. There is something romantic about that. Doing a thing for the sake of doing it. Meaning we're going to the moon, and we're going to the moon because of our scientific exploration. This goes back to this wistful thing of wishing that we could say that this person did this. Not as a China's person or whatever, but just as a human being. That seems magnificently far off. All right, so the other part to this, like I said, wishing that we were investing in spaceflight. And, talking about research and that type of thing, but doing it for the sake of doing it, not necessarily for any ulterior motive. Now, I am not that naive. why I believe that these are the things that are taking place. It is true that China is expanding its ability to go into space and everything else, and it is true. This was a technical feat to make this point. A major challenge for such a mission was communicating with the robotic lander, as there is no direct line of sight for signals for the far side of the moon. As a solution, China in May blasted the Quaheo satellite onto the moon's orbit positioning so they can relay data back between Earth and the lander. In another extreme hurdle, during the lunar night, which lasts for 14 Earth days, temperatures drop as low as negative 173 Celsius. During the lunar day, that lasts for 14 days, the temperature soars as high as 127 degrees Celsius. The rover's instruments have to withstand the fluctuation and has to generate enough energy to sustain it during the long night. Adding to the difficulties, Chang'e 4 was sent to the Atacama Basin in the lunar South Pole region, which is known for craggy, complex terrain. I guess my point is, there were several technical challenges that they had to overcome in order to make this work. The thing is, they're not doing this purely for scientific research any more than the United States going to the moon was being done for purely scientific research. This was done with an idea of us getting into space first and preventing the Soviet Union from gaining any sort of dominance in that sphere. We wanted to be the ones to be in space. In fact, of the matter is, when Sputnik went up, it sent somewhat of a panic within the United States Defense Departments. So, my point is, in the same way that we were going to the moon for militaristic reasons, using a front of a civilian organization, I suspect China is doing the exact same thing. Like, the resources that they're spending into this, it may be a military-run organization because it will likely or potentially be used for militaristic reasons in the case of a war. Do you honestly believe that if there was some war between the United States and China over kind of pissing match between the first and second power on the planet, that space will somehow not end up in an arena? There's no international law. At the very least, if nothing can be defended as international law. China is doing this to some degree to get logistics, to get understanding of how to operate in that sphere of influence. I suspect that the United States is probably going to be doing the same with this whole Space Force nonsense. But an accomplishment for China, an accomplishment from the standpoint of humanity. But let's be clear that the objectives of this, yes, it may be research, but part of that research is for militaristic reasons and to using that sphere of influence in order to attack or defend, for that matter. So, hooray, and it goes both ways, I suppose. But yeah, I would love for that to get to the point of oh, thank you, Patrick. I would love to get to the point where we're just human beings. And I know that's a kumbaya notion, but a human being was able to go to the dark side of the moon. A human being was able to go to Mars. Let the race and all that other stuff will matter less, but we're not there yet. We're nowhere near it. So, it's what it is. Alright. I'm going to end this. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through Patreon. And right, Cozy, Ingo Swan's book, Penetration. Yes, it's fun to read about the moon and the shadowy government. Yes, yes, Axelrod. Oh, don't get me onto that. Don't get me onto that. Don't get me onto that. Saying that there was something on the dark side of the moon. There was a base, and that there was like Axelrod was getting him the remote view of the dark side of the moon. And oh man, that book, yeah, that's awesome. It's awesome. Alright, I'm going to end this here. But hooray for China for getting to the dark side of the moon. Congrats. Thanks all. Ingo Swan. Oh, I love it.